Welcome to the first episode this week of the Fenway Rundown. I'm Sean McAdam. Chris Cotillo in Detroit with the Red Sox today. He will rejoin us for a second episode later this week. But pleased, beyond pleased, to have a good friend and a longtime friend join me today who's got a new book coming out tomorrow. We'll get to that in a minute, but we want to welcome in Scott Miller, longtime baseball writer, author, and all around good guy. Scott, how are you?
Real good, Sean. Nice to be with you. I've been looking forward to this one. It's been a little while since we've had a chance to talk after all those years of hanging out in the press box together in
Yep.
Fenway Park, the Metrodome, Target Field, and down and spending all those weeks in Fort Myers, Florida. Nice to see you again.
It is nice to see you too, Scott. And the reason we have you on is tomorrow, that is Tuesday, is the publication of your new book, Skipper: Why Baseball Managers Matter and Always Will. I'm going to hold that up there. That's backwards, of course, but people can get this at Amazon, at Barnes and Noble, at your local independent bookstores, and it comes highly recommended. Scott, I know this has been a project and a labor of love for you over the last few years. It's taken almost 3 years from inception to completion. Um, Tell me why this subject interested you and sort of the genesis of getting this book project started.
Well, it interested me simply because I think, Sean, I'm sure you and your circles have had many discussions over the past 5 or 6 years, as I have. It comes up in press boxes, it comes up over dinner, and that is, what does the manager do anymore? How many directions is he taking from the front office? Is it true that the analysts are running everything? And then there's that question: where do lineups come from? Are the managers getting them handed? I liken that's almost the modern day equivalent of, when kids ask parents, where do babies come from? That and where do lineups come from? It always elicits like awkward silences and shuffling of the feet, and nobody quite knows what to say. So, there's no question the job has changed. The job definition of a manager isn't today what it was 50 years ago. But that said, somebody's got to lead the boat, skipper, steer the boat, I should say. And it's still an important job. It's just different. And so anyway, after all years of these discussions, the past 3, 4, 5, 6 years, I looked and I thought that's a meaty topic to tackle, and B, probably meaty enough that it warrants more than just a long feature story somewhere. You could go book length with this. It was kind of difficult to organize it and kind of come up with a thread to run through, but that's basically the genesis of it.
When we look at the game now, Scott, I think a lot of people, you mentioned the influence of analytics and data, and
Yeah.
that certainly has had a dramatic effect on how baseball is played, how it's managed, how rosters are put together. It's infiltrated every aspect of the game. And I think we go back to maybe the early 2000s and what we saw as the beginning of the Moneyball era, right? And Oakland being able to take advantage of some things in the marketplace that were undervalued. That and the rise of the Red Sox and Theo Epstein were sort of the
Mhm.
beginning of the analytics revolution. If we're talking about how the managerial aspect of the game has changed, how managers' jobs changed, what's the turning point? Because they're no doubt related. The influence and influx of analytics and data has changed how the manager does his job. But if we see the early 2000s as the beginning of the analytics revolution in the front office, when did the manager's job in the dugout begin to change in your mind?
It was shortly after that. You're exactly right, Sean. That was a huge, to me, there were a couple of different pivot points on when the job changed and why and how it changed, which basically is what the book looks at. I started in the late 70s when Earl Weaver and Sparky Anderson and Billy Martin had all the power. But I started late 70s also because that's when the first computers were offered to the public, very
Mhm.
rudimentary. And we kind of go from then to now. And to your question, no doubt, the book Moneyball comes out in the early 2000s. And you nailed it. I think there were two things. One, what Oakland was doing, it started under Sandy Alderson, and then Billy Beane took over from Sandy Alderson. And he took the analytics to the next level. And what you said, the Red Sox with Theo and Terry Francona, um, in a book, I like it, the infamous Grady Little Pedro Martinez game. I say that's almost like the last shot heard of like the managerial gut decisions, right? It was after that all went to hell that front offices, and specifically in Boston, they realized our organization has put too much into things to let one man, even if he's the manager, on his own solo decision, um, go too far out on a limb because too many other people pay. So Moneyball in that year, that fall, and it was interesting too because I think it was both in 2003. The book comes out that fall is the Grady Little Pedro game, and then shortly after that, as Sandy Alderson eloquently explains in the book, um, I think what happened is you also had this sea change in ownership. Back in the 40s and 50s, a lot of baseball teams used to be, family run, families owned them, but you saw more corporate changes. And what happened was these are all businessmen. So as Sandy said, a lot of these businessmen read Moneyball, the owners, and that's really what opened the door is a lot of the owners read the book and were like, well, this makes sense. That this is how I made money in my other 20 businesses. Why should baseball be different? So that's one inflection point or pivot point. And then I think the next one, you go to 2012, 13, right in that era, when the White Sox let Ozzie Guillen go and they hired Robin Ventura to manage. And he was working in their farm system, but he hadn't managed or coached. The year before, he was helping his coach his son's high school team. And the same year, Tony La Russa retires, and the Cardinals add Mike Matheny to replace him. So I mentioned this because that's the part where all of a sudden there was no experience required anymore to manage. That was the other pivot point. Robin Ventura, Mike Matheny, and then that opened the door to Aaron Boone coming from the ESPN booth into the Yankees manager's office and many others.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, you talked about the ownership influence over managerial decisions, or at least managerial hires. Who do we want, uh, on the floor of the factory here, running the organization? How has the relationship between the general manager, who sometimes is now called president of baseball ops, chief baseball officer, whatever title is given, where do we trace the maybe collaborative relationship that now exists between those two? As you know, Scott, when we both started
Yep.
covering the game, you could go weeks without seeing the general manager of the team you're covering in the clubhouse. He was upstairs in his office. Occasionally, he might come down and watch batting practice, but he was not in the manager's office. He was not going through the clubhouse speaking with players. It was a very removed kind of position. Now you've got the general manager in discussing decisions before and after the game with managers. You've got contact with players. You've got relationships with the coaching staff. Where did that start in your mind?
Yeah, and that all of that makes it more difficult for the manager because in all these different various meetings, the front office guys that are talking to players, the manager is privy to some of that conversation, but maybe not all of it, and he's not sure what's the players being told, and communication is so important in an organization. I think the best organizations that blend analytics and managing and all of it together are the organizations that communicate the best, and the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. But to your question, that all started, not long after the Moneyball um, era, after 2002, 2003, especially out in Oakland, you had Billy Bean, working with Art Howe and then Ken Maka and being in the clubhouse. And it just kind of spread from there. And, it's interesting because there were so many old school teams that were kind of holdouts for a while, but, you know, say within the last 5 or 6 years, pretty much the last of the holdouts have started their own analytics department, got their own proprietary information, and gone down this road as well. And now, you know, yeah, I talked to Andy McPhail, who ran the Minnesota Twins when they won the 1987 and 91 World Series. And of course, Tom Kelly was his manager. And I talked to those guys. And, Andy used to tell Tom Kelly, my job's to put the roster together and then hand it over to you. And I don't come in the clubhouse and, that's your domain. And basically it was like, I'll do mine and you do yours.
Right. It was considered bad form for the
Yes.
GM to be in the clubhouse or manager's office too often.
Yeah, it was. And the manager didn't like it because, the players would see this and think that, maybe the manager didn't have the authority that he did have or should have. And, that's a lot of it too. And that brings it into the modern day because, you know, managers thread that needle today it's a very fine needle to thread because to your point, it was bad form back in the day. And part of it because the manager, if he's going to run the show, needs the respect of the players. And if they think he's just a puppet, that goes away. The respect goes away immediately. So now flash forward to today, and players are different anyway, but it's kind of there's a little bit of similarity there in that if a manager is viewed as just carrying out the front office's wishes and doing nothing else, then the respect in the clubhouse and in the dugout is gone pretty quickly.
Yeah. Toward that end, Scott, of the 30 franchises, how many do you think specifically? I'm not talking about input or suggestions or here's some data to consider. What percentage of managers or how many of the 30 major league managers are told this is your lineup for tonight at 7 o'clock? What's your guess? That
You know,
there's
yeah,
no simple answer to that. I realize it. We don't know. Well, this guy does and this guy doesn't. But
right.
what's your best guess about how many of the 30 are told who to play and where and when?
You know, I think it's fewer teams than people think. Uh, I'd say maybe two, three, four organizations, maybe that happens. But from talking to all the people I've talked to for the book, I think what is more common, and this gives plausible deniability, where the manager can say, "I write my own lineups," and the front office can say, "Hey, we don't dictate things." All of these meetings that are held, where analytics people pop in the manager's office and they give them all the reams of data, the spreadsheets, and this, that, and the other thing. I think that's where Dave Roberts uses the word out in Los Angeles, collaborative. It's a collaborative effort. And I think part of what that means is by the time, use the Dodgers as an example. And I shadowed Dave Roberts for 4 or 5 days, trying to get inside what life is like for a modern day manager. And he'll have, an analytics meeting maybe early in the afternoon. He gets there, he looks over things himself, and then maybe a couple of analytics people come into his office. They talk about that night's game. They talk about, the team. They talk about lefty righty matchups. They talk about who's hot, who's playing well, whatever. So he may have a meeting with analytics people at like 2 in the afternoon. And then possibly every now and then the second analytics guy, there might be a second meeting, and then after batting practice, they have the run prevention meeting, which basically is how long is our starting pitcher going to go tonight? What kind of shape's our bullpen in? Uh, if our starting pitcher gets knocked out early, these are the guys we can go to. If he doesn't, we go to these guys. They come up with different avenues. So anyway, out of back to the lineup question, I think what happens, the word collaboration is, I think teams, analysts don't necessarily hand the lineup and say, this is what we want to use tonight. in a couple instances, I think it happens, but more often than not, by the time the analytics meeting is done, everybody's on the same page. And Bob Melvin said that used to be how it was in Oakland when he managed in Oakland. He'd meet with the analytics guys and they'd say, well, this is why, like, this guy should lead off. He's our best hitter. We want him to the plate more often than anybody else. The second hitter, because this. So they have their ideas and then everybody leaves. So again, the plausible deniability. The manager maybe wasn't handed the lineup, but out of the meeting and the discussion comes an understanding. Yeah, this is what makes the most sense. Let's do this.
Sure. You break the book down into chapters and you address various kinds of managers and their histories. You talk about the dictators, and that would be, the old school guys who really are not around anymore. We're talking about the Billy Martins and the Earl Weavers and the kind of, Dick Williams, kind
Yeah.
of crusty old school, spent their baseball lifers. Those are basically extinct now. They
Yeah.
really can't survive in today's game. But you talk also about player managers, and the guy who perhaps best embodies that category is someone that you and I both know well and like a lot, and that's Tito Francona, who, of course, managed here, then in Cleveland, and after a year off is now in Cincinnati. What makes Tito, in your mind, not only the prototypical player manager, but really a guy who could work and fit in almost anywhere?
I think there are a few things. One, he's really smart, even though he pulls that dumb act. He acts
Sure.
like I don't know, but he's really smart. He's adaptable, and I think he was, the one reason he was the perfect guy at the perfect time for me for the 2004 Red Sox is what people forget, and we talked about this, Tito and I. What people forget is after he was fired from Philadelphia and he bounced managing and he bounced around to a couple different coaching staffs. He spent 1 year on Oakland's bench as the bench coach. I think it was 2002, the year or 02 or '03, right around that time before he took over the Red Sox. And he was only there a year, but it really was an awakening for him because he was able to see the Moneyball stuff from the inside and how it worked and how the numbers made sense and how that all came together. So, you know, that was almost like a postdoctorate education for him. And even though he's almost in so many ways old school, he was smart enough to see what happened in Oakland. And so that when he came to Boston, and Theo Epstein and Jed Hoyer and the staff had some different ideas about statistics and things. Tito wasn't old school at that point enough to just blow everything off. He had just been in Oakland furthering his education. And so I think as far as a player's manager, like I say, smart, adaptable, uh, is has a base in analytics from those days. And I think one common misconception about players managers, Sean, is obviously they have to get along well with the players and they have a great relationship. But that doesn't necessarily mean just let the players do what they want and hands off and I just sit back and run what hopefully is a happy ship. There's a lot more to it than that. And as players will say with Francona, he never for even though he's 68 now or whatever he is, he's never forgotten that he's played. He remembers how hard it is to play this game. So he comes at it with an understanding. He's got a great sense of humor. That helps too. But he comes at it with an understanding that even players in their 20s today appreciate. Even, the age gap might have gotten a lot bigger than when it was when Tito was in Boston in 2004. He wasn't that much older than his players. Today he is, but some of these same principles still carry forward.
Yeah, and you talk about, and I've heard Theo Epstein say this, and I know that Tito has said it in kind of his own homespun way,
Yeah.
but the days of telling a player to do something are over. It's explaining to a player why it's important or why he should do something. How has that changed the role, and does that lessen the authority of the manager? When you still ultimately have the lineup card as your weapon. If you're not happy with a player, you can reduce playing time, you can sit them, you can drop them in the order, you can not use them in certain spots. But players now, in terms of the player manager relationship, players expect to hear the reasoning behind why they're being asked to do certain things.
You're exactly right. And Bruce Bochy, I quote him in the book almost verbatim what you said. I talked to Boch about the changes during his career because he came up when managers still had a lot of
Iron
final
fist.
authority.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's changed. And Boch is a great example of somebody who's adapted. And yeah, he said that exact same thing. He said the biggest difference when I first came up, you would tell a player what to do. Now you've got to explain why it's good for the team, why it's good for him, why it all should happen. And I think to a degree it reduces the authority of a manager in one area, in the area we just talked about. But and this is why I still maintain managers are important, and as the subtitle says, why baseball managers are important always will be. It may reduce authority in one area, but then there are other areas the manager has to make up for that, such as communication, which is such a big deal today. Um, there are skill sets, and like I say, kind of the nut of the book is what the job was like, field manager in the late 70s, 80s, back in that era, what the job is like today, how we got from then to now, and why we got from then to now. And the job description is absolutely different. The job Alex Cora is doing today isn't the job. He's in the lineage of the Red Sox, but it's not the same job Don Zimmer was doing in the late 1970s or Joe Morgan or Dick Williams in the Impossible Dream season. It's Alex Cora's got a different job. And within that, I go to communication because one thing that I found that was really instructive in Detroit, for example, Sparky Anderson, he didn't want to get to know his players. And Earl Weaver really didn't either. And Sparky always maintained, I know there's going to come a day when I've got to release a player, trade a player. And if I get to know him and his family, it's gonna hurt more. It's gonna be tougher. Dan Petrie, who played number two to Jack Morris's number one in the Tigers' great 1984 rotation. I talked to Dan about Sparky because some of the old guys I couldn't get to anymore. So I talked to players who played for them. And Petrie said, we were so scared of Sparky. He said, the only times you ever got called into Sparky's office were A, if you were getting sent down, or B, if he wanted to chew you out about you screwed up something in the game today and he needed to see you. He said, we never got called in to get a pat on the back. And I told the other coaches, like, keep me as far from Sparky's office as you can. Now, today, back to Dave Roberts, one of his things when I hung around with him for a while, one of his big things is, as he says, I want to touch each one of my 26 players before the game. And by touch, he means just some kind of interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be a wink and a nod and a hello in the clubhouse over lunch. It could be like, hey, Joe, I know your wife's 3 months pregnant now. How's she doing? Stuff like that. And Dave said, I said, you've been at this a while. You got to be pretty confident and comfortable. Is there ever a night where you're going into a game when you don't feel great about things? He said, the only time ever is when I don't get a chance to touch all of my guys before the game. Maybe I had an extra analytics meeting called that afternoon, or there was a marketing department that wanted me to go speak at some statue dedication, which, by the way, can you imagine if Earl Weaver or Sparky Anderson, if they got, hey, we need you to speak at a statue
I don't think that would
dedication.
go well.
I don't think so. But Dave said that's
All
when
part
you
of the job now.
yeah, it is. And that's why I say, so you go back to a player, it could undercut a manager's authority when instead of telling a player what to do, he kind of has to explain why. But then on the other hand, you have these other skill sets or part of the skill set, the other skills you need to have to navigate as a manager today. that the old guys didn't. So you can kind of what you lose here make up for a little bit over here.
Right. Where do you fit Alex Cora in this continuum here, Scott? Is he basically the modern players manager? Where does he fit on the scale of the modern day manager?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think a player's manager in that it's not been that long since his playing days, and he's personable and gets along with everybody, and he understands and he communicates. Um, but at the same time, I mean, obviously, Rafael Devers, this whole thing is, things are more difficult in Boston. In fact, it's funny. I sat down with Tito for a long time, couple different interviews. One was during his last year in Cleveland, and he acknowledged, we're talking about the Boston days, and he said he mentioned Alex Cora, and he said, you know, that certain markets, Boston being one, and you know this, I don't have to tell you this, with the media, with the attention, the fans, the passion. He said that's more of a young man's market. Tito said, I couldn't do that as we sit here today. Alex has the energy, he's got the smarts, he can navigate that.
You know, as we talk about how the job has evolved, Scott, it used to be you would see with teams, particularly those that made managerial changes fairly regularly, um, you would see the pendulum go from one kind of manager to the next. You
Right. Yep.
have the disciplinarian. Oh, that didn't work after 3 years. Let's go to a player's manager. This guy was too soft. Players ran over him. We need to go back to the hard ass. What's the pendulum now? What's the counterpoint to the players guy?
You know, I don't know if there is one. And I say that because another area of the job's different, and you and I can remember the old way. Um, Lou Piniella, Tom Kelly, who I worked with in Minnesota for so long. I mean, there was a long time, even from the media side, if you asked the wrong question, um, and a lot of it might be prefaced by you brought in Joe Jones to pitch the seventh inning. Did you consider bringing in Joe Smith?
Yep.
That was always one that would get them going because, like Tom Kelly, he's like, "What the f do you mean? Did I consider that? Yes, I considered that." And they may chew your head off today because of every team has its own television network. That's I maintain this is the biggest reason. Um, they all the games are on TV. All the pre and post game press conferences are shown. So basically, today the manager, aside from the baseball skills, he's got to be a PR guy to an extent because the organization wants they understand everybody understands the manager now is the face of the organization. He's out front every press conference, before games, after game, and it's like a way to invite the fans in. And nobody wants to risk an old grumpy manager that might blow up and throw a fit and drop a bunch of F bombs because that's all going to be out there now on TV or on social media. So I don't know. To your point, it's a good question. The counterpoint to the players manager, I guess maybe it would be a buttoned up analytics type of manager that works with the front office, but you're not going to get that hard ass manager anymore because teams just everything's nice today, and teams know, like in one press conference, um, things can get ugly, and if the manager blows, it looks bad for everybody in the organization. So all 30 guys today are varying degrees of nice.
Right. Yeah, they have to be media savvy. They are the face and front of the
Yeah.
franchise. Which kind of leads me, your last answer, Scott, leads me to the last question. We know that baseball operations staffs are now full of what are called analysts. These
Yeah.
are often Ivy League educated. They could easily be working on Wall Street or in investment banks or some other field, but they happen to have an affinity for baseball. So they're taking their data and their interpretive skills and their analytic skills to baseball. Will we ever see somebody like that managing in uniform, somebody that didn't play the game, that didn't have any background, that didn't play pro ball, that didn't have come up through the minor leagues. Is that on the horizon at all? Is this ultimately where this leads us?
I wouldn't be surprised. But I'm not saying it's all of a sudden that's going to be a new trend. But the reason I say I wouldn't be surprised is because the managers now, and they're an extension of the front office, basically. They have to carry out the philosophy of the front office. And so often the front offices are an extension of the owner. The owner hires the baseball ops guy or whatever, and the owner knows exactly what he wants, and so it all becomes an extension of the next of the guy up above you, and it. I don't know that it's for the good of the game because I think in many cases certain organizations are too homogenous. They could probably benefit from the manager thinking a little differently than the front office does, and from the owner, not even in a bad way, but just to get more ideas and more ways of doing things. Whereas so many times a day that, like I say, it's all just an extension of the next guy. So from that perspective, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see an analyst, Ivy Leaguer type manage. But that said, I think it would have to be a very unique situation where that guy, I mean, we all have our different stereotypes of different people, right? And like the Ivy League stereotype, oh, brainiacs, not great communicators. They'd rather be at their computer than have human interaction. It would have to be an Ivy Leaguer type that's kind of the opposite of that last part. He'd have to be a real people person. Again, going back to the communication, uh, because another skills part of a manager's skill set today has to be when he gets information from the analysts, he has to sell that to the players as well. And that's something that, Earl Weaver and Billy Martin never even had to consider, whereas guys today do. So I think if you had an Ivy League guy who could do that and really connected well with people, I think you could probably that very well might. I think that could happen. Now, I would think you'd have to have an old baseball guy as a bench coach to
Right,
just
right.
remind him, like, hey,
Provide a little experience and old school
yeah,
to the right of him in the dugout. The book is Skipper: Why Baseball Managers Matter and Always Will, by my good friend Scott Miller. If you are a baseball fan, I promise you will enjoy this book. It's a fascinating look at the trajectory of the role of manager over the last 40 years with lots of insight, lots of reporting, lots of fabulous interviews, and a lot of hard work. Scott, best of luck with the book. Thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
my pleasure, Sean. Anytime. Really enjoyed talking with you always. Again, be it in the old, now gone Metrodome or here today.
When the buildings are gone that we used to hang out with Scott, it must mean we're old.
Or something like that. I don't know. You feel like you're still 20 at heart, and all of a sudden things start disappearing.
Yep. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.